we are going to talk about complex imaginary numbers. So we have a square root of a negative value. It's not real, but we have assigned a value to it. So a negative, or square root of a negative number is I. So for instance, if we have square root of negative 3, we can split this up into two factors. Square root of negative 1 times square root of 3. Square root of negative 1 is I, and we'll have square root 3. This is my preferred way of writing this. I have also seen it written as square root 3i, and I don't typically like to place anything behind the square root if I don't need to. Square root of negative 25, that's square root of negative 1 times square root of 25. So we'll have square root of 25 is 5, and then square root of negative 1 is I. A lot of times when we have a negative value of a perfect square, we just simply say, well, that's 6i. Anytime students see a negative under the radical, they automatically pull an I out and then work the value. And then another one we have to look at is I squared. If we square I, well, if I is negative, square root of negative 1, if we square that, we get the value of negative 1. So if we have 2i squared, that will be 4i squared, but I squared is negative 1, which is negative, which then in fact this would be negative 4. So that's another one you have to watch out for, is the I squared, especially when you're multiplying complex numbers together. So for instance, if we have square root of negative 64, that'll be 8i. We have square root of negative 12. We know we'll have an I. I square root 12. If you reduce 12, that'll be 3 and 4. Square root of 3, square root of 4. Square root of 4 is 2, so we'll have 2i square root 3. Or some people write this as 2 square root 3i, since the 2 and the square root 3 go together. So again, this is my preferred method because, again, I don't like to stick anything behind the radical, because sometimes when I write too fast, the value that is behind the radical may look like it is in the radical. Then when we get into complex numbers, that was I, or the imaginary number. When we get into complex numbers, we have a real part and imaginary part. So we have a plus or minus bi, where a is the real part and b is the imaginary part. So let's look at let's identify the real parts and imaginary parts. So if we have 2 plus 3i, 2 is the real part and 3 is the imaginary part. If we have, and I'm going to write it in the way I write it, just so you have an understanding how I write things and how you can pick out what the imaginary part is. If we have 1 minus 2i square root 3, the real part is 1, and the imaginary part is actually 2 square root 3. And that's why some people like to write it in this fashion, because the 2 square root 3 has to be together for the imaginary part. So don't get confused on the way that you see these written. just remember that the imaginary part is with the I, so you pick out all the numbers that you pick out all the numbers and just leave I alone. That would be your imaginary part. And this concludes the introductory of complex or imaginary numbers.